Imagine lying in the dense jungle, sweat dripping as the air feels heavy and alive with the sound of buzzing insects. Suddenly, a distant gunshot cuts through the night, followed by faint shouts in a foreign language. You're 19, barely out of high school, drafted into a war you barely understand, and every shadow feels like it's moving. How do you sleep when death might be just a few feet away? This was the nightly reality for US soldiers in Vietnam. Tonight we'll step into their boots and confront the unimaginable challenges they faced, as well as the lasting effects of such horror on those who survived. Welcome back everyone, glad to see you again. If you enjoy these videos, be sure to leave a like, comment where you're tuning in from and what your dream is in life. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and enjoy this stroll through history. The jungle in Vietnam wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing nightmare. Picture this. The moment the sun sets, the oppressive heat doesn't dwindle. It seems to hang in the air like a thick veil, refusing to let you catch a single breath of relief. The humidity is suffocating, wrapping around you like a wet blanket you can't shake off. You're lying in the dirt or maybe against a tree trying to get comfortable with nothing but the faint moonlight filtering through twisted branches overhead. It should be quiet, but it's far from it. Every rustle in the undergrowth makes you flinch. Shrill insect calls fill the air, loud enough to drown out your own thoughts until suddenly you hear the sharp crack of a distant rifle, a noise that sends a shock through your entire body, reminding you that no matter how tired you are, sleep isn't a guarantee, not when one wrong move could cost you your life. The jungle never lets you forget that you're being watched. Maybe it's by the soldiers you came here with, equally on edge, or maybe it's by someone else, someone you can't see in the pitch dark. You don't know what's worse. The occasional staccato burst of gunfire in the distance, or the dull, unending silence that follows as everyone holds their breath. It's easy for your mind to start playing tricks on you. Was that just the wind moving the leaves? Or was that a whisper? Maybe even footsteps? Try closing your eyes in that environment. Try convincing yourself, even for a second, that you're safe. Soldiers recount lying awake, listening to the humming buzz of mosquitoes, the screams of cicadas, and something else beneath it all. An edge of danger that hummed through everything, turning every noise into a potential sign of something or someone lurking just out of reach. And this wasn't just a single night. This was their reality, sometimes for months at a time. The unrelenting humidity wasn't just inconvenient, it broke the body down. Imagine wearing the same clothes day after day, soaked in sweat. If the monsoon rains came, everything on you would stay wet, making even walking a miserable, blister-inducing challenge. The soldiers' feet rotted in their own boots, covered in sores from never having the chance to dry out. Your only relief might be when the heat finally eased, only for the nights to grow so cold you shivered uncontrollably under the flimsy weight of your damp uniform. This relentless cycle was enough to wear anyone down physically. Add the psychological toll to that. The constant thought that the foliage around you could be hiding an enemy who, at this very moment, is aiming a weapon in your direction. And you have a pressure that grinds down any semblance of normality or control. And then there were the traps. Even if your immediate surroundings seemed harmless, even if it was just the jungle, soldiers knew better than to trust it. The Viet Cong were experts in guerrilla warfare, turning the jungle into their ally. They would set up punji sticks, sharpened bamboo spikes coated with poison or feces to ensure infection if pierced. These were hidden in pits, covered with thin layers of grass or leaves. Tripwires could lead to explosives, sending shockwaves through the jungle and tearing through anyone nearby in seconds. The soldiers living through this couldn't trust their senses. A patch of ground that looked flat could turn into a deadly trap, and a friendly-looking villager could turn around and hold a signal grenade for a nearby ambush. Every single step had to be taken carefully, deliberately, and without trust. The constant paranoia was a survival mechanism, but it was also exhausting. One Vietnam vet described the experience of lying awake at night, staring up at the jungle canopy and listening to a distant firefight rumble like thunder over the hills. In that moment, he said, you never really felt alone. The jungle had a way of getting into your head, making you feel like it was alive. The snakes, the mosquitoes, the rats scrambling around your feet. They were all soldiers in their own way, working for the terrain itself, which seemed intent on proving how dangerous it could be. He jokingly called it a conspiracy between the bugs and the trees, but there wasn't much humour in his voice when he tried to explain the sheer psychological weight of that. Rest. That wasn't an option, not in the way we think of it. Even if you managed to close your eyes, the jungle didn't shut off. Then came the dreams, or more accurately, nightmares. Nightmares of home, your family, your friends, all disappearing as you woke up in the thick of it again with no escape. The few soldiers who claimed they got used to it weren't exactly thriving. They just learned how to move through the motions to distract themselves. Many relied on camaraderie, joking with each other just enough to lighten the otherwise suffocating sense of doom. Some swore by little rituals like always relacing one boot a specific way to feel just a bit more grounded, to trick themselves into believing they had control, even when it was a lie. But nobody truly thrived. They either survived or they didn't. There's another story of a squad camped out who thought they had finally gotten a peaceful night, only to wake up at dawn and realize that the Viet Cong had been quietly carving traps into the clearing around them while they slept. They'd been surrounded without ever noticing the shifting shadows, the soft rustles they dismissed as just the wind. Stories like that became part of the jungle's mythology, reinforcing the idea that survival wasn't about strength. It was about awareness, hyper-awareness, a constant, unblinking state of readiness that wore your nerves down to threads. Many developed habits the military didn't teach them. They would sleep in half-hour shifts, stay on their feet instead of lying down, and some even refused to take their boots off for fear of being caught unprepared. The result of all this was a particular type of exhaustion. Not just physical fatigue, but a mental fog. Something deeper that the soldiers sometimes couldn't even put into words themselves. Days blurred into nights, and the jungle never seemed to mark the passage of time. As one soldier put it, you felt like the jungle could swallow time itself. You couldn't tell if you'd been there a week, a year, or 70 years. And the Viet Cong capitalized on that. They knew the terrain inside and out, using it as more than just cover. They made the jungle itself a weapon. Adaptation wasn't equal across the board. Some men, often the younger ones, seemed to freeze under the pressure. They couldn't process the environment or the danger fast enough. It simply broke them. Others hardened, but not in a way that spoke of health or resilience. They hardened in the sense that they became numb, barely reacting to sights or sounds that, back home, would have sent someone screaming. They disconnected. And this psychological distance, while helping some survive in the short term, left scars that wouldn't fade after the war was over. This brings us to an important part of many soldiers' experiences. They weren't trained for this. Basic training back in the United States hadn't prepared them for fighting in the jungle, because quite frankly, nobody really knew how to prepare them. Most came from suburban neighbourhoods or small towns. They hadn't slept under trees in weather that drenched you in sweat at noon and gave you chills by midnight. They hadn't spent hours navigating dense overgrowth where visibility was barely 5 feet in front of them, and they hadn't learned how to fight an enemy who understood the land better than they ever could, who used it to their advantage at every turn. Many soldiers weren't even given adequate tools. Early on they were handed M16 rifles that were prone to jamming in the humid heat. Some say it felt like they were being set up to fail, and in many ways they were. The lack of preparation isn't just about survival skills either. Soldiers received little psychological training for the mental strain they'd endure. Most were young, barely adults, who'd never been asked to reckon with the kinds of fears and stresses they faced daily. They didn't know how to process what they were experiencing, especially when every moment felt like it might be their last. That sense of inexperience, of raw vulnerability, hung heavy over the entire war. And for many, it made the jungle feel like more than a battlefield. It felt like purgatory, a place they would never fully leave, even if they made it out alive. But despite everything working against them, soldiers often leaned on each other in ways that went beyond basic teamwork. There are stories of men forming bonds as tight as family, depending on shared humour and whispered conversations late into the night to keep themselves tethered to some shred of humanity. For some, this was enough to get through another day. For others, it simply wasn't enough. The jungle demanded everything from those who entered it, and for many even that wasn't enough for survival. It's this inexperience, this raw, unpolished entry into a world most of them couldn't understand, that paints a clearer picture of the soldiers themselves. These young men were thrust into an environment that tore them down physically and mentally before they even had a chance to adapt. And things were about to get harder, because if the jungle itself wasn't dangerous enough, what they would face next would make even the nights spent listening to distant gunfire seem almost manageable. What was it like to be just 19 and sent halfway across the world to fight in a war you barely understood? For many young American men in the 1960s, this wasn't just a question. It became their reality, sometimes with little warning. One day you're bagging groceries, studying for exams, or hanging out with friends at a diner. The next, your draft notice arrives in the mail, and suddenly you're being told to pack your bags, leave everything familiar behind, and prepare for war. Not just any war either. This was Vietnam, a country most Americans couldn't find on a map back then, let alone explain why they were fighting there. The draft system during the Vietnam War was about as random as a lottery, assuming the prize in question was being thrust into a deadly conflict. From August 1964 to February 1973, over 1.8 million men were selected for military service through conscription. Think about that. 1.5 million people, many with no intention of joining the military, being pulled from their lives without a say in the matter. And it wasn't fair either. Young men from lower-income households and working-class neighbourhoods were disproportionately affected, as wealthy families could often find ways to avoid service through college deferments or other loopholes. It's no wonder so many draft protests erupted on college campuses and in cities across the US. For some, it felt like fighting a war at home just to stay out of the one overseas. For those who were drafted, the transition was more than just physical. It was an emotional and mental shock. Imagine the routine comforts of life. Your mum cooking dinner, your dog barking at the mailman, the sound of baseball on someone's radio in the neighbourhood, all being ripped away in an instant. Suddenly you're in a foreign environment where nothing feels safe. Many of these young men had never even left their hometowns before receiving their draft notice, let alone travel to a place with jungles, monsoons, and an enemy they couldn't even see. You didn't get the luxury of easing into it either. Once your notice came, you were swept into the machine. Basic training pushed you physically to prepare you for war, but in reality it wasn't enough to prepare you for Vietnam. That wasn't just a war of strategy or strength. It was a war of attrition, paranoia, and endurance. And these weren't seasoned soldiers with years of experience. Most of them were kids, barely adults. The average age of US troops in Vietnam was 22. Only 22. Let that sink in for a second. For most of these young men, this was supposed to be the time they were starting to find themselves, starting to live. Instead, they were handed a rifle and told to fight an enemy they didn't even understand. Out of the 58,220 American troops killed in Vietnam, 61% of them were under the age of 21. Over 11,000 had barely reached 20. Can you imagine the weight of that? Barely old enough to drink legally, if you could drink legally at all in your state, and already facing death daily. One such heartbreaking story belongs to Private First Class Fred Womack, just 19 years old when he was drafted and sent to Vietnam. Fred had been a high school running back, proud of his small-town roots and planning to work in his father's workshop after graduation. His letters home started out optimistic. He told his little sister to keep cheering for the Dallas Cowboys and reassured his parents that basic training wasn't as bad as the movies made it seem. But once deployed, his tone began to shift. In one particular letter, he described waking up in the jungle to the sound of mortar fire and realizing he had no idea how long they'd been surrounded or who was even attacking. "The nights are the worst," he wrote. "You can't tell what's out there, and the waiting just makes the fear build up in your chest until you forget how to breathe." Fred never came home. He was killed in action just 6 months later, one of thousands of young men whose lives were cut short before they even had the chance to begin. The tragedy of the Vietnam War wasn't just in the fighting or the deaths, though there was plenty of both. It was in the isolation these boys felt once they were torn from their homes and thrust into an entirely different world. Many described feeling utterly removed from any sense of normalcy, a deep-seated disconnection that made the experience all the more brutal. Thrown into an environment where they didn't speak the language, didn't understand the culture, and couldn't always tell friend from foe, the loneliness transformed into a crushing weight. Imagine being a teenager from small-town Ohio, never having met someone who spoke Vietnamese, and now being expected to navigate a war zone where everyone speaking the language makes you second-guess their intentions. This sense of isolation only deepened when it became clear how little the soldiers understood about the war they were fighting. Vietnam wasn't as simple as black and white battles with clear victories. It was murky, confusing, and deeply political. While the US government pushed a narrative about defending democracy and stopping communism, the soldiers on the ground weren't seeing that. They were seeing villages destroyed by napalm. They were seeing civilians, men, women, and children caught in the crossfire. They were being asked to trust local allies, yet sometimes those same allies would turn out to be working with the Viet Cong. This wasn't a war where you could trust the lines drawn on the map. It was one where the ground beneath your feet, or the person smiling in front of you, could betray you in an instant. These moral dilemmas often left soldiers questioning not only the war, but their own actions. How do you reconcile patrolling a village one day, handing out food and medical supplies, only to hear that the same village may have harboured enemy fighters the night before? How do you face the guilt of not knowing whether you've done more harm than good, or the realization that sometimes there simply wasn't a right choice? These weren't questions most 19-year-olds were ready to face, and yet, in Vietnam, There was no time to avoid them. For some soldiers, the only thing keeping them grounded was their brothers in arms, the small unit of men who fought alongside them every day. In the stories of survivors, you can hear the deep bonds that formed in the fire of combat. They weren't just friends, for many they became closer than family. These relationships offered a rare source of comfort and stability in a world otherwise defined by chaos and uncertainty. Harold Thompson, a Marine who served 2 tours in Vietnam, recalled how his squad would spend their rare moments of downtime telling stories about home, dreaming out loud about what they'd do when they made it back. It was the only thing keeping us sane half the time, knowing you had someone there who'd have your back no matter what, he said. But these bonds came with their own emotional toll. For every soldier lost, their comrades had to carry that loss with them, a constant reminder of how fragile survival really was. And yet, not everyone cracked under the pressure. Some showed remarkable resilience. They found ways to adapt, to block out the fear, to push forward despite every reason to lose hope. But even those who came home alive weren't the same as when they left. That group of 19-year-olds who went to Vietnam returned home older, not just in years, but in experience. They'd seen things most people couldn't imagine, let alone understand. And for many of them, the wounds left by the war weren't the kind that could heal with time. It's a cruel irony that many of these young men were sent to fight a faceless enemy in a foreign land, only to return home and face an entirely different war. Public opinion about Vietnam was deeply divided at the time, and many veterans returned to a country that didn't welcome them as heroes, but instead judged them for participating in a war so many protested. This added another layer to the disconnection they felt. First from the world they were sent to during the war, and then from the world they came back to. But none of these challenges could compare to what lay hidden in the jungle. Beyond the emotional shocks and the disconnection, there were the constant reminders that their own lives could end in an instant. Booby traps, ambushes, and silent enemies turned every step into a gamble, which we'll dive into next. Would you know where to walk if the ground could kill you? Because in Vietnam there wasn't always a safe place to stand. What if the ground you were standing on could kill you? In Vietnam it often did. For US soldiers, danger wasn't always something you could see in front of you, it was everywhere. It could be under your foot, in the trees, buried right next to you, or even camouflaged into the jungle so perfectly that by the time you noticed, it was already too late. This wasn't a traditional battlefield with defined lines and clear objectives. It was a twisted, unforgiving game of survival, one where the Viet Cong controlled the rules. Not through sheer firepower or numbers, but through tactics designed to exploit every weakness, both physical and mental. The Viet Cong were masters of guerrilla warfare. They didn't meet US forces head-on because they didn't have to. Instead, they let the jungle do most of the heavy lifting. They knew the terrain inside and out, every inch of every path, every waterway, every dense patch of trees. And they didn't just hide in the jungle, they turned it into a weapon. The most infamous example? Booby traps. Now, these weren't just your standard pitfalls or snares. The Viet Cong had a wide arsenal of traps, some terrifyingly simple and others devilishly complex, but all effective at keeping American troops on edge. Take punji sticks, for instance. These were sharpened bamboo stakes buried in pits, hidden under thin layers of grass or leaves. Step in the wrong spot, and the stakes would go straight through your boots, impaling your foot or leg. But it didn't stop there. Many of these stakes were coated in poison or feces, ensuring that even a minor wound could become infected and completely incapacitate a soldier. More elaborate traps were variations of the same theme, foot pressure triggers that would launch spikes or nails at a soldier's torso, or weighted mechanisms that would swing sharpened stakes down from trees like a pendulum. even standing still wasn't safe. Soldiers had to scan every square inch of the terrain, constantly afraid that each step forward might be their last. Imagine living like that for days, weeks, months, every move a gamble. And these traps weren't just about causing casualties. They were also psychological weapons designed to sow paranoia and break morale. Soldiers couldn't relax, couldn't trust the terrain beneath their own feet. Even basic tasks like setting up camp or crossing a clearing became a nerve-wracking exercise in caution. A single mistake could mean death or serious injury, not just for one soldier but for anyone unlucky enough to be nearby when a trap triggered. The constant tension gnawed away at nerves, creating an environment where every step felt like walking blindfolded through a minefield. The Viet Cong knew this effect wasn't immediate but cumulative. Slowly, over time, it broke people down in ways that bullets and bombs couldn't. But as terrifying as the booby traps were, they were only part of the Viet Cong's strategy. Ambush tactics were their bread and butter. Picture this. You're patrolling a seemingly quiet village. Nothing but the distant noise of cicadas and your boots crunching on the dirt. The day has been quiet, almost boring. And then, out of nowhere it happens. A burst of gunfire from the trees, a grenade rolling into your group. You haven't even had time to figure out where the shots are coming from when your enemy vanishes, gone like ghosts into the jungle. This is what the Viet Cong excelled at, hit-and-run attacks. They didn't stick around to fight extended battles, which would have given the Americans an advantage. Instead, they struck fast, disappeared even faster, and left chaos in their wake. Their ability to vanish had a lot to do with a hidden network of tunnels, some of which stretched for miles underground. These weren't just hideouts, they were entire systems, complete with barracks, kitchens, workshops, and medical facilities. The Cu Chi tunnels, one of the most famous networks, spanned more than 120 kilometers near Saigon. These tunnels allowed the Viet Cong to hide from airstrikes, move supplies without being seen, and strike targets before melting back into the earth. For American soldiers, this was maddening. How do you fight an enemy you can't even see? How do you win when at every turn it feels like you're being hunted? The frustration of searching for an opponent who seemed invisible compounded the psychological toll. US troops spent long hours combing through jungles and villages, only for most missions to end without firing a shot. And yet the silence wasn't comforting. It was the calm before the storm, the hours of boredom before seconds of terror, as many described it. The anticipation of an attack they couldn't predict was exhausting in itself. Even small firefights, often sparked by ambushes, carried an intensity that wore soldiers down over time. The enemy dictated the terms of every engagement. They chose when and where to strike, leaving American forces constantly on the defensive, always reacting and never truly gaining control. The Viet Cong's resourcefulness played a key role in their success. They made do with what they had, often building weapons and traps from scavenged materials. Unexploded American bombs provided a wealth of explosives they could repurpose. Bamboo, easily accessible and durable, became a foundation for everything from stakes to structural supports. Every part of the Viet Cong's approach reflected their ability to turn disadvantages into advantages. They couldn't match American firepower, so they avoided it. They couldn't afford to lose large numbers of troops in direct combat, so they fought smarter, not harder. Every move was calculated to wear the enemy down physically and mentally. Living through this took a toll on the American troops. Imagine being out there, surrounded by a dense canopy of leaves, trying not only to survive but to complete your mission. You're exhausted, sweating, hungry. You can't trust the path ahead, the trees around you, or the sounds you're hearing. A crack from a branch could be an enemy sniper, or just a monkey. You don't know. That constant uncertainty, added to the sheer physical demands of jungle warfare, created an atmosphere of paranoia unlike anything most soldiers had ever experienced. Some adapted by developing hyper-awareness, almost as if their senses went into overdrive to process every sound and shadow. But hypervigilance comes with a price. You can only be on high alert for so long before your mind starts to crack under the strain. For others, the fear of making a mistake or leading their squad into a trap was paralyzing. The psychological scars left by that kind of tension didn't just fade when the battles were over. Many carried them home, but it wasn't just a matter of facing the traps and ambushes themselves. It was the knowledge that the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, lurking in every shadow, every tunnel, every hidden corner of a village. The Viet Cong made trust nearly impossible, and when trust broke down, morale followed. Soldiers began second-guessing orders, questioning their surroundings, and sometimes even doubting the intentions of the villagers they were supposedly there to protect. Every encounter came with a question, friend or foe. The answer wasn't always clear, and getting it wrong could have devastating consequences. As one veteran described it, you didn't just feel hunted, you felt outsmarted, like the jungle was laughing at you. That humiliation, that loss of control, made a war that was already difficult feel impossible. It wasn't just about surviving the day. It was about enduring weeks, months, and even years of feeling like the jungle itself was the real enemy, bending to the will of the Viet Cong while you were just an intruder trying to make it out alive. Yet, there were stories of soldiers developing intricate strategies to cope. Some insisted on scouting areas personally before letting their squad set foot on unfamiliar terrain. Others carried small markers, stones, bits of fabric, to leave behind as breadcrumbs, hoping it would keep them from stumbling into an ambush or doubling back onto their own tracks. Some even learned how to listen to the forest itself, picking up crucial cues that might indicate danger. But for every soldier who adapted, there were many more who found the brutality of guerrilla warfare too much to bear. It wasn't just about survival in the moment. It was about carrying the weight of constant fear for an extended period, a burden no one was truly prepared for. Even American technology and firepower, overwhelming as they were, couldn't eliminate the psychological impact of this invisible enemy. Troops might call in airstrikes or napalm runs on suspected Viet Cong positions, leveling entire stretches of jungle or villages, but the results were often temporary. The Viet Cong would simply move to another location, disappearing back into their tunnels or blending into the local population. It was a constant reminder that while the Americans had the superior weapons, the Viet Cong had mastered the art of psychological warfare. And as the body count rose, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't just a war of attrition, it was a war of erosion, chipping away at the American forces inch by inch. And yet, throughout all of this, there was a deeper frustration brewing. Trust didn't stop at the traps, ambushes, or tunnels. It extended to relationships with local communities. American soldiers were torn daily between seeing villagers as people in need of help and potential collaborators for the Viet Cong. That tension further complicated an already difficult environment, and it was bound to boil over. Because when paranoia reached its limit, the line between right and wrong often disappeared entirely. What happened in villages would leave scars too, not just on the soldiers, but on the people of Vietnam. And the consequences of those strained relationships would become one of the war's darkest legacies. Imagine walking into a village where every smiling face could hide a deadly secret. The sun's beating down, making the humidity cling to your skin like a second layer, and your squad moves cautiously through the narrow dirt paths. There's a woman crouched by her cooking fire stirring a pot. A group of children laugh and chase each other near a water buffalo tied to a post. On the surface it almost feels peaceful, but you've seen this before. The woman, the kids, even the elders sitting in the shade of a palm, they could all be helping the Viet Cong. There's no way to know for sure, and that uncertainty, it's always there, pressing down on you harder than the heat. Relationships between US soldiers and Vietnamese villagers were complicated from the start. This wasn't Europe during World War II, where soldiers expected parades and celebrations when they marched through liberated towns. In Vietnam, things were murky, uneasy. The villagers didn't always see the Americans as heroes. Many didn't want them there at all. In some cases, they were simply scared. Of the Americans, of the Viet Cong, of what could happen if they aligned themselves with either side. It wasn't uncommon to encounter villagers who smiled and offered food, then found yourself ambushed an hour later because someone in that same village tipped off the Viet Cong. Every interaction became a question of trust that, more often than not, simply wasn't there. Making matters worse, language and cultural barriers created even more tension. Many American soldiers couldn't speak Vietnamese, and most villagers didn't speak English. Attempts to communicate were often clumsy or misunderstood, which only heightened the sense of unease. Soldiers, especially those fresh out of training, weren't prepared to navigate the subtleties of a culture so far removed from their own. Every gesture or phrase could carry a meaning they didn't understand, and when you add the pressure of combat, the stress of always looking over your shoulder for an attack, it's easy to see how fear turned to suspicion, and how suspicion could turn deadly. The Viet Cong were experts at blending in. They operated within communities, sometimes even posing as farmers during the day before picking up weapons by night. Families might host Viet Cong fighters in their homes out of loyalty, or just as often out of fear. If they refused, they risked retaliation from the Viet Cong. If they cooperated, they risked the Americans finding out and accusing them of being traitors. It was a no-win situation for many villagers, and one that left American troops constantly unsure of who was safe to trust. The paranoia this created spread quickly, like wildfire, until every interaction carried a hidden edge. You couldn't shake a child's hand without wondering if they'd placed a grenade under your truck. You couldn't accept a villager's offer of rice without questioning if they'd poisoned it, or worse, if they'd leaked your location. And that's exactly how the Viet Cong wanted it. Their strategy relied on this confusion and mistrust, using it to break down the already fragile relationships between US forces and Vietnamese civilians. For the Americans, who often saw themselves as liberators, this dynamic was a harsh reality check. Many believed they were there to protect the local population, but how do you protect someone when you can't discern whether they see you as savior or invader? How do you help a family when you suspect their son might be keeping weapons hidden under the floorboards? These weren't just questions soldiers grappled with once in a while. They were constant every single day. But there were exceptions. Some villages genuinely supported the American presence, seeing them as a bulwark against the Viet Cong. These villagers would offer intelligence, food, or even guide soldiers through dangerous terrain. There are stories of farmers quietly pointing toward traps or warning of ambushes up ahead. One soldier recalled a moment when an elderly Vietnamese woman silently gestured at an odd pile of leaves on the ground, subtly warning him of a hidden punji pit. In those moments, trust seemed possible, but it was always fragile. Soldiers didn't know if this kindness was genuine or simply an act meant to protect the villagers themselves. After all, helping the Americans could spark brutal retaliation from the Viet Cong later on. For some villagers, these choices weren't about loyalty, they were about survival. Despite these rare glimmers of cooperation, the overwhelming uncertainty led to tragedy more often than not. Soldiers operating on fear sometimes made split-second decisions with devastating consequences. Mistakes happened. Suspected Viet Cong could turn out to be innocent farmers. An entire family might be displaced, or worse, because one soldier misread the situation. And the paranoia worked both ways. Villagers who might have been open to aiding the Americans sometimes avoided contact entirely, fearing the soldiers would view them as spies no matter what they said or did. This created a vicious cycle, mistrust breeding mistrust, escalating tensions to a point where violent outcomes felt inevitable. Perhaps the most horrifying example of this came on March 16th, 1968, in the village of My Lai. That morning, a company of US soldiers entered the village, already on edge from previous ambushes and booby traps encountered in the area. The soldiers had been briefed to expect Viet Cong activity, and they were primed for a fight. But what unfolded was no firefight. Instead, they killed between 300 and 400 unarmed civilians, men, women, children, and infants. No one was spared, not even the elderly. Some victims were rounded up and executed en masse. Others were killed inside their homes. It was a massacre, one that exposed the deepest failures of the war, the fear, the anger, the dehumanization that had crept so deeply into every interaction between the two sides. The My Lai massacre wasn't an isolated event, though its scale of brutality made it stand out. It was, in many ways, the result of months, even years, of paranoia boiling over. For soldiers who lived with constant suspicion, who couldn't tell friend from foe, and who had seen their comrades killed by traps and ambushes, the line between combatant and civilian had blurred long before they entered My Lai. None of this excuses what happened, of course, but it does highlight the psychological toll that this constant uncertainty took on soldiers, teenagers mostly, thrust into a world where clear answers didn't exist, and every choice felt like a gamble between life and death. The fallout from My Lai was immense. It shattered whatever illusions remained about the nobility of the war effort, casting a dark shadow over the US military's presence in Vietnam. News of the massacre didn't reach the American public until more than a year later, when investigative journalist Seymour Hersh exposed the full extent of what had occurred. By then, My Lai had become a grim symbol of everything that had gone wrong, a breakdown in discipline, in morality, in the very humanity needed to navigate a conflict this complex. For the soldiers who participated, some claimed they were just following orders. Others were haunted by what they'd done, unable to reconcile their actions with the people they were before Vietnam. And for those who weren't directly involved but had witnessed similar incidents on a smaller scale, My Lai was a stark reminder of how easily fear and paranoia could spiral out of control when trust had already disintegrated. Of course, not all interactions between US soldiers and Vietnamese civilians ended in tragedy. There are countless stories, small, quiet ones, of kindness breaking through the tension, a soldier sharing his rations with village children, a medic helping to treat a villager's wounds, a farmer leading a patrol away from a certain ambush. These moments mattered. They didn't undo the horrors or erase the mistrust, but they offered glimpses of what could have been if the circumstances had been different. If fear hadn't consumed so much of the soldier-villager relationship, maybe those moments of mutual humanity could have been the norm instead of the exception. But that wasn't the reality of Vietnam. The paranoia left scars not just on the people of Vietnam but on the soldiers who came home with those memories burned into their minds. Imagine surviving that war, coming back home, and trying to explain to family and friends what it was like to live every day, wondering if the woman offering you tea in her hut was sending assassins after you when you left. How do you talk about the fear of smiling kids running up to your squad? Fear because they might be holding grenades instead of asking for candy? You don't. You bury it. And for many veterans, that emotional weight became one of the hardest parts of the war to carry. Every soldier in Vietnam faced moral conundrums every day. Do you fire first, or do you wait too long and risk an ambush? Do you trust the farmer who claims he hasn't seen any Viet Cong, or do you assume he's lying to protect himself and possibly an enemy? There wasn't a clear playbook for these situations, and the truth is, there were rarely any right choices to be made. Which is perhaps the cruelest lesson of all. Vietnam wasn't just a war you fought on the ground or in the jungle. It was a war fought in the mind, in the space between trust and doubt, right and wrong. Some men walked that tightrope and found their balance, others fell off entirely. And even for those who seemingly managed to stay upright, the effects didn't disappear when their tour ended. How could they? Returning to civilian life meant trying to untangle years of paranoia and suspicion, trying to remind yourself that grocery store cashiers or kind strangers weren't secretly working against you, but those slits, the hyper-awareness, the split-second decision-making, it's not easy to let those go after they've been wired into your brain for so long. It's no surprise then that so many veterans returned home carrying the psychological weight of everything they'd experienced in those Vietnamese villages. And that weight, as we'll see next, would define the rest of their lives, long after the war itself ended. What does it cost to survive a war like Vietnam? For many soldiers, the price wasn't measured in broken bones or scars, but in the quiet battles fought long after the last bullet was fired. The price was their peace of mind. For some, it was their connection to a normal life, stolen by memories they couldn't shake. And for others, it was everything: their families, their futures, their ability to live without fear. Vietnam didn't just end when the helicopters left Saigon. For those who fought, the war came home with them, and some never found a way to leave it behind. It was the kind of stress that rewired your brain. Long before PTSD, the term we now use to describe the mental toll of trauma, was officially recognized in 1980, Vietnam veterans were already living with its reality. Back then, they didn't have a neat label for what was happening to them. There was no clear way to explain why they jumped every time a car backfired, why crowded places made their skin crawl, or why they woke up in a cold sweat night after night. They couldn't even tell you exactly what they were feeling. But they didn't need to explain it because many of the other vets around them already knew. The memories threaded through them like shrapnel, embedded too deep to pull out without pain. For so many soldiers, Vietnam had been a place of constant stress. It wasn't just the fear of being killed, it was the moral tightrope they had to walk every day. The lines between right and wrong, between friend and enemy, had blurred so much that surviving often meant making decisions they regretted seconds later. Imagine carrying that weight home with you, playing it over and over in your head, like a tape that never shuts off. The noise doesn't fade, the tape doesn't stop. A moment you live through in the jungle finds ways to creep into your mind during dinner, at work, or as you're lying in bed trying to sleep. Soldiers dealt with flashbacks so vivid it was like being dragged back through time. A gunshot in the distance could send them straight to a firefight they thought they'd never survive. A certain smell, burning rubber, gasoline, even overcooked meat, could yank them right back to the jungle to smoke rising from a village on fire. PTSD among Vietnam veterans wasn't just widespread, it was staggering in its scope. The National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study in the 1980s found that approximately 15% of Vietnam veterans were suffering from PTSD even years after the war had ended. But that study only scratched the surface. Depending on the level of trauma experienced during their deployment, some soldiers were almost twice as likely to die prematurely compared to their counterparts who had been exposed to less combat stress. And for those deeply scarred by the war, the early deaths weren't always physical. In many cases, they came from within, a slow unravelling brought on by substances, despair, isolation, and untreated symptoms. The long-term effects on these veterans' lives went beyond flashbacks. Depression and anxiety loomed large, their weight heavy and unrelenting. Some tried to quiet the noise with alcohol, numbing the memories with every sip. Others turned to drugs, desperate for anything that might create an escape. Statistics paint a grim picture of this struggle. Nearly 1 in 3 veterans with war zone-related PTSD also met the criteria for major depression. For many, it wasn't just about what they saw in Vietnam. It was about the world they came home to and how different it seemed. They left one battlefield only to find another waiting for them in their own communities. Take the story of Danny, a Marine who served 2 tours in Vietnam. Before the war, Danny was the kind of guy everyone in his small Oklahoma town liked. Easygoing, known for his pickup basketball games, and always quick with a joke. But when he came back, he wasn't the same. He didn't complain much, and his family didn't ask too many questions. But Danny started drinking heavily, going through 3 six-packs of beer a day just to dull the edge he felt whenever he heard a loud noise. He rarely slept more than a few hours at a time, always waking up in a panic, certain he'd heard footsteps outside his window or whispers in the dark. When the nightmares came, he could barely describe them, and when he did, his voice dropped to a whisper. Afraid of pulling the memories out of the corners of his mind, Danny tried his best to fit back in. He worked odd jobs, even married a few years later, but the presence of the war never left. His wife once said he startled so violently at the sound of their son's BB gun that he accidentally knocked over the table and broke his hand in the process. By the time Danny finally opened up about his experiences, joining a local veteran support group, it was too late to repair much of the damage. The war had already claimed decades of his life, piece by piece. His story isn't unique. Thousands of men brought the war home just like he did, carrying it quietly, letting it shape them in ways they couldn't control. Veterans like Danny faced not only their internal battles, but also a society that seemed to turn its back on them. Public opposition to the Vietnam War cast a long shadow over those who fought, some of whom never wanted to be there in the first place. Rather than returning as celebrated heroes, many veterans were met with indifference. Others faced outright hostility, being spat on or called baby killers by strangers in their own country. The lack of support was tangible. Early on, PTSD wasn't even recognized as a condition, so many veterans weren't eligible for meaningful mental health care through the VA. Support systems were patchy at best, leaving veterans to cope on their own or rely on families that didn't always understand the depths of what they were going through. The long-term toll of this lack of support rippled far beyond the individual soldiers. Families bore the weight of broken relationships, explosive tempers, and unpredictable moods. Imagine being a child in a house where your father fights battles against invisible enemies, terrified of something you can't see or fix, or being a spouse who grows used to walking on eggshells, doing everything possible not to set off a man who flinches at every slammed door. Communities saw the impact too, as veterans became isolated, unable to hold steady jobs or maintain close relationships. Many veterans found it difficult to reintegrate into a world that now felt alien to them, and for some that world gave up on them, pushing them to the edges of society where they were mostly forgotten. Yet, despite all of this, some veterans did manage to find solace. For many, it was through connecting with others who shared their experiences. Support groups became lifelines, offering a space where they didn't have to explain themselves, because everyone in the room already understood. Organizations like Vietnam Veterans of America grew out of this need, providing advocacy, camaraderie, and a place to turn when no one else seemed to care. Some veterans channeled their pain into activism, fighting not just for better treatment for themselves, but for the next generation of soldiers. They lobbied for stronger VA programs, mental health resources, and acknowledgement of the psychological wounds caused by war. But even these victories came with a bittersweet edge, because for many veterans the trauma didn't disappear, it only became more manageable. Whole lives were shaped by the events of a few years. For some, Vietnam left them permanently changed in ways they couldn't fully recover from. And for those who didn't make it to those support groups, who struggled alone or succumbed to their demons, the cost of survival was, tragically, their lives. The Vietnam War forced America to reckon with the invisible injuries of conflict. Earlier wars had veterans coming home with trauma too, but Vietnam's veterans were among the first to have their struggles recognized as a legitimate psychological condition. The war taught hard lessons about the long-term effects of combat stress, a lesson that shaped policies for veterans of later conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it's worth asking, what else could have been done for the Vietnam veterans at the time? How much suffering could have been avoided if society has been more understanding earlier? Even today, the legacy of Vietnam lingers in the stories of those who fought, in their absence when they didn't make it back, and in the ways it shaped their families and communities. And for those veterans still living, the echoes of that war remain a part of their lives. But whatever peace they've found is hard won, and for those who didn't find it, they remind us just how high the cost of survival can truly be. Vietnam wasn't just a war fought in the jungle, it was one that followed you home, and for many it never left. The Vietnam War reminds us that the cost of war isn't just measured in lives lost, but in the lingering pain of those who survived. Soldiers endured not only the jungle's terrors, but years of guilt, isolation, and trauma that reshaped their futures. Their resilience speaks volumes. They carried unimaginable burdens, both on the battlefield and after returning home. As General Maxwell Taylor once cautioned, "Until we know the enemy, and know our allies, and know ourselves, we'd better keep out of this kind of dirty business." Let their sacrifices be a lesson, a reminder to remember, reflect, and do better. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It really does help me out. Thank you for listening, everyone, and good night.